everyone. We are back and we welcome a very special guest from the OECD all the way from Paris, where maybe we can try and pass a motion for us to do our next meeting there in person. Ms. Nicole, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it. I understand you have an opening statement. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see you again and also to meet the other members of your committee. Thank you indeed for inviting me to appear before you today. As the lead author of this report, I'm pleased to present it and discuss the OECD review of the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Office, published just earlier this week. I have followed the PBO very closely since its creation in 2006, from the early days under Kevin Page through to the tenures of Jean-Denis Frichette and Yves Giroux, and now Jason Jakes. The institution has remained effective from the outset while steadily growing in stature. It's now one of the strongest institutions of its kind and ranks at the top of the OECD's Fiscal Advocacy Index. Despite its small size, it has an outsized impact, both there in Canada and also here internationally, strengthening fiscal transparency at home and contributing to the development of peers internationally abroad. The PBO is not alone and is part of a growing trend. In fact, we have seen independent fiscal institutions like the PBO become a core part of the fiscal architecture across many OECD countries. In fact, today, 33 out of the 38 OECD countries are supported by an independent fiscal institution, and we outline principles for these institutions in the OECD recommendations for independent fiscal institutions. One of these principles is, of course, periodic external examination. And this first review of the Canadian PBO was commissioned by the interim Parliamentary Budget Officer last September. A change of leadership, indeed, provides an opportune moment to reflect on the office, what is going well, and how it could be further improved. To inform the review, the OECD convened an international team with deep practical experience. We had Anthony Close, the inaugural Parliamentary Budget Officer from the state of Victoria in Australia. We had Jeffrey Novak, the Financial Accountability Officer for Ontario. And we had Bert Smit, who is the Programme Leader for Macrofinance at the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis, one of the oldest independent fiscal institutions in the OECD. The team interviewed a wide range of parliamentary, governmental, and non-governmental stakeholders in Ottawa. Our discussions benefited greatly from the insights shared by these stakeholders, including you, Mr. Chair, and the contributions of many others that we met. I would like to express my sincere thanks to all of those who gave us their time and expertise. Their perspectives have been invaluable in shaping our recommendations. So what do we find? Well, the PBO is indeed a cornerstone of Canada's fiscal accountability framework. The 2017 legislative reforms helped strengthen its independence and access to information, and the organisation's analytical depth and active leadership have further enhanced its impact and credibility. These strengths underpin the PBO's strong international standing atop of the OECD's Fiscal Advocacy Index. As Canada's fiscal environment becomes more complex, with ambitious spending reviews, rising fiscal pressures, and heightened geopolitical uncertainty, the demands placed on the budget and also thus on the Parliamentary Budget Office continue to grow. These developments reinforce the need for a strong and independent institution that can help Parliament and the public understand fiscal choices. To support the PBO's continued resilience and effectiveness, the review identifies 5 priority areas for focused improvement. These relate to leadership appointments, access to information, quality assurance, communications, and finally, prioritization and productivity. The PBO has already begun taking steps in several of these areas. Advancing this work will help ensure that it continues to deliver high-quality, trusted analysis that empowers understanding and supports informed debate and strengthens confidence in Canada's fiscal governance. The PBO has indeed been influential since its inception, but its most important contribution is likely to lie ahead. Further strengthening it now will equip Parliament and the public with the independent analysis it needs to navigate the fiscal choices that will shape the years to come. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate that. We'll start with Mrs. Jansen for 6 minutes, please.
I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to come back to the esteemed PBO for a question. So if we permanently increase defense spending by tens of billions of dollars, that money comes from the same pool of tax dollars that funds health transfers, seniors' benefits, and support for families. So that spending comes out of the same pot as every other federal priority. If we choose to borrow to finance it, then on top of that spending itself, interest costs are going to rise as well. So that further reduces the room available for everything else. Could you explain how borrowing for such an enormously risky project will impact affordability for Canadians?
So in terms of increasing defense spending, more broadly, you mentioned additional deficit financing. There are other options available to the government as well, including finding additional revenue sources and as well potentially transferring or reducing spending in other areas and reallocating that money to additional defense spending. And that's obviously something that we see now as part of the CER and the government's review as part of targeting the $60 billion in existing operating spending and redeploying a good part of that to other areas, of which a good part of it ends up being defense. In terms of the impact of additional or increased borrowing on affordability, the path would be potentially primarily through interest rates. So to the extent that the Government of Canada chooses to substantially increase its borrowing, potentially the cost of borrowing or there's an increased cost associated with borrowing that money, interest rates end up being higher, and as a consequence of that, the government itself potentially needs to, obviously it takes money away from other areas of spending. It also competes with other people in financial markets. So to the extent to which the government is out, it needs to pay more, it pushes up borrowing costs for everyone. And as those borrowing costs increase, for your mortgages, for your auto loan, for your line of credit, it definitely places pressure on affordability. I
had another question in regards to the way that this money is requested. So as I understand it, they haven't explained where it is that they're going to spend all this money over the next however many years. It's just not clear, what are you getting? What are you buying? And I was thinking it's kind of like a business going to the bank and saying, like a farm. I go to the bank and I say, hey, by the way, over the next 10 years, I'm going to spend this many millions of dollars. I don't know exactly where I'm going to spend it. I can't tell you yet, but it's going to be transformative and it's going to catalyze growth. I don't think that my bank will give me money without a bit more detail. How is it that we as Canadians actually have to accept this way of doing business?
We do. What I'd say is we do have some detail. So to give National Defense credit, they do share with us every 6 months a very comprehensive Excel workbook with all of their planned capital spending over the next 20 years. It certainly does not reconcile up to the full NATO 5% commitment, but there is whatever information the government has available on the defense acquisition side, they are sharing with us, and they have shared with us in the past. To speak to the gap that you identified, so we have some information but not everything. ultimately, everything needs to go through Parliament. So while the government did table a defense policy document last week, which does not provide all the underlying details, not a cent of public money can be spent in these areas unless they come through you. They come through this committee, and it's appropriated by Parliament.
And yet I think today we're kind of hearing that, there are things we won't know, we'll have to vote for before we actually get those details.
In the case of Vote 50, that is the case. If parliamentarians are comfortable with providing additional discretion in Vote 50, so appropriating the $1 billion that will be managed by the Treasury Board Secretariat for defense and security, and then report it back on at some future date.
Kind of like that, going back to the farmer, going to the bank and saying, hey, I need this much money, I'll let you know later what it is I'm buying.
Well, if you're going to the bank as a farmer and you've been farming for 30 years and you know your banker and you have a good relationship with them and your kids have gone to school together, potentially there's a bit more discretion provided by the bank. And again, I'm not paid to defend the government's structure.
You did sound a little skeptical, though, about the size of what they're trying to do and the scope of what they're trying to do.
I think it's a dynamic environment, and we don't have all the details. I would also say in the specific case of Vote 50, there's a reason why it stands out, and it's because the rest of the approval process looks very different.
Right.
So,
and you did mention there was something like this before, and it didn't last for very long.
The Parliament of the day and parliamentarians at the time were not comfortable
Right.
with what vote previously Treasury Board Vote 40. The context was different. Parliamentarians were different. It was a different composition. I guess I will look forward to seeing what the reaction is from Parliament.
I know this parliamentarian loves transparency. We like to know what we're voting on because it's very painful for things to be hidden from us and vote for something we perhaps will really disagree with. I was just wondering about the reprofiling.
I'm sorry, that is our time. Oh. We'll go to Mr. Osborne, please. Go ahead for 6 minutes, please.
I will share my time with my colleagues. I have two questions, and if
I'm sorry, Ms. Khalid told me Mr. Osborne is up.
oh,
Yeah,
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and I apologize to the official from OECD. I was intending to ask her some questions, but based on the last line of questions, I've changed my mind. So to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Vote 50 is a contingency fund. Do you trust the officials at Treasury Board because they have to approve any of these allotments? They have to analyze any requests out of this fund. And in the changing geopolitical world that we are in and the need to expand our national defense, I understand why we have a contingency fund, Vote 50 there. Absolutely understand. And based on the actions of this government, as one of our previous members had identified, we have the largest foreign direct investment in Canada in 18 years. So I think breaking down interprovincial trade barriers, breaking down or building new trade corridors and national defense spending is in large part attributing to that foreign direct investment, I would think. But back to my question, Treasury Board officials have to analyze any requests out of Vote 50, correct?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And Treasury Board officials will determine and justify whether or not a request for this funding is justified.
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
So we should have, this is, I think this is a transparent process because this funding will eventually go to estimates, be viewed by you, be viewed by parliamentarians, be viewed by the Auditor General. This is not something that we're hiding behind closet doors and saying, we're going to make decisions without anybody knowing. Is that correct?
I would say, looking at Vote 50, and it looks, the legislative language looks very similar to Treasury Board Vote 5, which has been there for a very long time. And in that context, in that situation, parliamentarians have determined that they're comfortable providing the government with discretion around $1 billion in Treasury Board Vote 5 to deal with urgent and unforeseen circumstances, so to cede some of their legislative control and authority to the government in that specific area. And it's up to parliamentarians to determine whether they're comfortable doing the same thing with respect to Treasury Board Vote 50.
Okay. But, I mean, the transparency is there as, one bead of the string of pearls leads to the next, and this is all reported, will be reviewed by you, reviewed by the Auditor General, and by parliamentarians.
Yeah, yes, and there are additional ways outside of the estimates process to further enhance transparency. So and I seem to recall in the past, it's going back about a decade, when the government's used similar centralized votes previously, they can report on the actual allocation outside of the estimates process as they see fit. So if there are concerns around transparency, obviously there are further options. And as I mentioned earlier, I've never seen a government official come to the table and after receiving a recommendation from a parliamentarian to enhance transparency around financial reporting, say no.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. I will now go to the OECD questions.
A minute and a bit. Please go
I
ahead.
have a minute and a bit, okay. I'll ask if you can briefly explain the methodology used by the OECD to evaluate independent fiscal institutions, how consistency is maintained across country reviews with different political and institutional contexts.
Thank you for that question. And indeed, we have got a review framework that we use for each and every one of these reviews. And it is guided by the OECD's principles for independent fiscal institutions. And that forms really the core of our review framework. And what we do is we look at our principles and the way in which the institutions align with these principles. And that allows us to have a common assessment framework. And we have a database which shows how all of the institutions perform across different aspects of these principles, which we can use to compare the institutions internationally.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 10 seconds. Pass it on to my colleague Pauline when it comes to her turn.
Madame Gaudreau.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My questions will be for Ms. Nicole. And since you're in Paris, I will speak the language of Molière. Are you receiving the interpretation into English? I'm taking some time to allow you to adjust. Is it working? Can you hear the interpretation? Yes? Excellent. I'd like to pick up on the report. In terms of recommendations and observations, I'd like to know more about transparency. I want to hear your perspective, and then we can discuss. What about transparency at the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer?
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. I will answer in English.
So transparency is one of the 9 principles for independent fiscal institutions, one of the 9 areas where we have principles for independent fiscal institutions. And as these institutions are promoters of transparency, they have a strong duty to act as transparently as possible. And in fact, the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Office, we find, is very transparent by international measures. And these sorts of measures include having all the reports published on their website, having their own website, making sure that they are open to questions about their methods and models, and that they are presenting their work to Parliament. So by these headline measures, the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada stands as one of the more transparent institutions across the OECD. Of course, there are always areas which can be improved, and some of these were highlighted in our report. We felt there could be greater transparency on the peer review process, for example, the quality assurance process, which, as mentioned earlier by the interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, was something that was very much in practice in the office, but hadn't been formalized on paper and transparency communicated with different stakeholders. So there's always ways in which these institutions can further improve their transparency, and indeed we've highlighted ways that we hope the Parliamentary Budget Office will take forward in coming years.
Ben, merci beaucoup. Ma prochaine
Thank you very much. My next comment concerns, well, either transparency is always increased and improved, but what about your assessment throughout the OECD on disclosure of information for PBOs to be able to properly do their work and provide the information that parliamentarians wish to have?
So, do you mean access to information?
Oui, en fait, je vais prendre le...
Yes, I'll take the time I need. Transparency, well, there's disclosure of information that's submitted when data is collected, but transparency is also disclosure of the work tools to produce reports. And I want to know if in your analysis, because here what happens, we don't always have the information for the Parliamentary Budget Officer to provide information. So that's why transparency is important to me to define it. Do you have an analysis on collecting data?
Yeah, so we have different areas that we've got analysis on as part of this review. So one of the areas which we looked at was the way in which the office is able to access information, and the other side of the coin, as you rightly point out, is the extent to which it promotes transparency in its work. On the gathering information side, we found that the institution and this area has been strengthened in recent years. And we found that, in particular, the 2017 legislation helped strengthen access to information, but there's still some way to go, in particular, the access to tax microdata, which doesn't enable the PBO to do timely and transparent analysis in this area. We also felt there was some space to improve the access to information through establishing memorandum of understanding with government departments on a routine and consistent basis. In terms of how it presents the information, one of the aspects that we felt was that there could be some greater consistency in terms of the methods and the way in which methods are documented by the institution. I think there's no question that if anyone asks anything of the institution, they're open with their methods and their models, and they're never trying to hide the way that they've done their work. But it's certainly best practice among these institutions to ensure that there's consistent presentation of methodology across different outputs. And that's something that we'd like to see continue to improve in coming years.
Madame Nicole, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
3-minute round, and then finish up with 1 minute with Madame Gaudreau. Mrs. Block.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Nicole, for joining us today. I just want to express my gratitude to the Conservative government back in 2006, who thought it was very necessary to create the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer. I recognize that there were reforms in 2017 that strengthened the office, and just want to thank Mr. Jakes for actually calling for a review of his own office to get a good sense of where perhaps improvements needed to be made. So I want to turn to the recommendations that you provided, which I think really require legislators to take a look at. And your targeted recommendations are in regards to safeguarding the independence of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, as well as sustaining the performance, which I think we're all pretty proud of the fact that our Parliamentary Budget Office is ranked #1 in the world when it comes to being an international leader in fiscal oversight. So I want to ask about leadership appointments, and if you could elaborate more on what we could do here in Canada to ensure that we have set clear arrangements for timely appointments, remove reappointment options, and introduce structured interim arrangements with cross-party backing.
Thank you for that question. Indeed, I do think that in order to strengthen the leadership appointment process, it is likely that there would need to be legislative amendments. And the challenges that we're talking about have really arisen because we've seen persistent delays in permanent leadership appointments in recent, just in recent history. And I think this does present risks for the PBO's independence and stability. So what we would like to see is we'd like to see changes to the legislation that, for example, stipulate that the appointment must be made in a certain period in advance of the outgoing Parliamentary Budget Officer. For example, in Portugal, for the Public Finance Council, it's in legislation that the appointment of their leadership must take place up to 60 days, so at least 60 days before the end of the current terms. And so there is a precedent for this sort of timeliness to be put in legislation. And indeed, within the Canadian government's own guidance on governing council appointments, it says that it should only be in exceptional circumstances that there are interim appointments. So having something within the legislation that sets out that it should be timely, then also stipulating some criteria for any interim arrangements. So what sort of qualifications would you look for anyone to have if they are going to fulfill that interim role? I think something that could be quite interesting for you to consider.
I apologize. I have to interrupt. We're past our time. Can I just get you to wrap up the response, and then we'll go over to Ms. Rochford. Thanks, Ms. Nicole.
Yeah, no worries. I think it could be interesting to look at the Ontario office, whereby they have someone who can, within the office, who steps up as the Parliamentary Budget Officer if there is no appointment in time. And that's an interesting model that you can look at the national level in Canada.
Ms. Rochford.
Thank you so much. And so basically, your review notes that the PBO's impact is closely tied to media engagement, and it recommended a more formal communication strategy. So I would welcome your views on when does visibility become a risk to the perceived neutrality of the PBO. And our PBO mentioned that they've released a communication framework, and I was wondering if you had seen it, reviewed it, and if you felt that it addressed this particular issue of visibility versus neutrality. So first question. Second question, quickly. I'm not sure, Mr. Jacques, how many times that you've come before a committee, but I counted 14, and I don't know if that's correct. But I would welcome our guest's view on how does she view that as a concern vis-a-vis the recommendation in the report related to independence. Is there any risk there of that contravening the issue of independence? So I turn that back to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those questions. So in terms of visibility and neutrality, it is true that when you are very visible as an institution, you are increasingly in the crossfire, the political crossfire, and this makes it increasingly difficult to be seen as neutral, particularly if you have a government that is in period for a long number of years and you're not able to show that you're applying the same scrutiny regardless of the party that is in power. But what we see is when these institutions are very visible, it's important that they are strong institutions and that their independence is highly guarded. So that means having a robust and strong legislative framework. And that's one of the reasons why we are so, we feel it's so important that these chinks in the armor of the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada are addressed. The ones that we have pointed out within our review are particularly important to address, given that the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada is so exposed within the media. But nobody that we spoke to ever doubted the neutrality of the office and the fact that the office is non-partisan. And that's something that came across very clearly in a review. And I think that shows us that they've been able to walk that line between visibility and neutrality very well in recent years. I've forgotten what your second question
The 14
was.
appearances before this committee. Do you
Just a brief response if you can.
Yeah, it's fantastic that the Parliamentary Budget Officer is engaging so well with parliamentary committees, because this enables it to really inform the debate and the parliamentary debate in a way that is only helpful for Canada writ large.
Thanks. And Madame Gaudreau for 1 minute.
En fait, je me sens très
In
généreuse.
fact, I feel very generous. Ms. Nicole, I thank you for joining us. Thank you for the information you've given us. I'd like to give the next seconds to Mr. Jacques in light of what we've said over the last half hour.
Je pense que ici au Canada,
I think here in Canada, we are fortunate to have parliamentarians who have a great level of interest in numbers and facts. And I think Canadians are well served by you, by members of Parliament. With policy debates, they're always tied to the facts and the numbers. And that gives me a lot of confidence in the future for Canada. And I'm proud to be Canadian. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Very much. Ms. Nicole, we will excuse you. Thank you for joining us today. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you for your report and the affirmation of the great work our PBO does. It's greatly appreciated. Mr. Jakes, thanks again for being with us. I think this is your 30th appearance this week with us. And your final one as interim PBO. Truly appreciate all the work that you've done for Parliament, and especially for this committee. You truly are a great friend of this committee. So sincerely appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again in whatever capacity follows you next.